Some people tend to say ignorance is bliss, and while that may be true for good people, that is not the case for our villains. People who ignore the truth and harm others alongside the way that do not deserve any intention or any definition of bliss in their lives. The parts of any being who let their hearts harden to deny any chance that was worth living and ending up to the darker side of it all. This is a case that Toy Story was so good at showing in terms of both heroes and villains thinking about the important journey that Woody took. You think about the purpose of any toy and what they mean to a child, and then you truly understand the importance of their own existence. Taking it a step further to what Toy Story 2 became as a perfect sequel, moving from a child as an actual villain to starting to have toys take their place. Not that it was bad that they left out aspects of actual humans for toys, but how it was a great move regardless to focus on a bunch of toys that are somewhat negative opposites of our main characters themselves. The beginning that happened with Stinky Pete as the first major toys villain in Toy Story. One introduced as a figure never opened to the outside of his box, wasting his way on his shelf until he gets handled in Big Al's collection to be shipped off to Japan. The first instance of what you see in a regular well-mannered toy who just never had a chance with kids, slowly degrading into an embittered angry old toy who rejects the idea that love could ever happen to him. Well, of course we don't go as far as mentioning love within his character, but how you're able to see what made him so with his interactions with other toys like Jessie who were given up during the inevitable course of growing up. Just again, how it's all thanks to the rare fact that Toy Story 2 was everything and more for what a film should have been that surpasses its own predecessor. To talk about the emotional impact a villain has if they choose to ignore something that they never got to experience, and to understand that they could be better if they opened themselves to an idea but decide if they choose not to. But before we begin talking about Stinky Pete specifically, we of course have to understand the beginning of Toy Story 2 on Woody's side, since most of these proclaimed characters like Pete and Jessie were part of Woody's roundup. This is where we learned that Andy planned to take Woody to cowboy camp with him, having Buzz hold down the fort, making sure everything was in tip-top shape to lead, in his typical panicky fashion where he lost his hat for a time. Of course, as the story goes, something bad happens, like Woody getting his arm ripped a little on accident from Andy, where he has to be put on the shelf for fix later. The point being of the minor things that can break toys can make them lost forever, where nobody would want to play with them anymore. Overreactions being the hallmark of his own character, not knowing if Andy wants to play with him or have him in his life, or just throw him away because he's virtually damaged goods. The importance here to understand is to put yourself into the mind of a toy, the fear of losing purpose if you are broken to the point where you have to be thrown away, the love you have from a kid that is only temporary, where you don't know what happens next in your stage in life. Only one thing is possible compared to the next step that is akin to death. So when Woody accidentally gets stolen by Al McWiggin, this is when these questions are opened up a bit more. Introduced to the joyful cheers of Jessie, Bullseye, and of course Stinky Pete never opened from his own box. A group he knows not of at first, but then discovering Al's collection of Woody's roundup and knowing that they were part of it. The priceless popularity he used to hold upon the masses in the 50s when westerns and the cowboy craze took off, demonstrating an entire world to which he belonged. But also finding out that this world wants him in Tokyo away from Andy and the rest of his friends, which splits things apart. Of course, at first when Pete appears, it's more of a practical understanding of both sides in what he was not opened from, but mainly delegating that attitude to Jessie, who's experienced such great pain knowing that Woody had an owner. That they go back into the dark if he's not able to come out, where he hatches a plan to help make amends and convince Woody that this current life is not worth what a new one would bring. So after getting his arm fixed, he encourages Woody to learn about Jessie's past, the history with Emily, and what that meant to her. It's about understanding a cycle that has already happened, being loved by an owner who was technically her whole world to her until she herself grew up, putting them in a charity box after years of collecting dust, causing the fear of claustrophobia to grow because this era of life was over, thinking she was abandoned for another idea because she grew up. That after everything she loved that was together, it all fell apart because of the fact that Emily moved on from that stage of life. And again, you put in the same knowledge of Woody's perspective in his overreactive fear about his own life with Andy, knowing he could be thrown away, you understand he would turn 180 to join in and live peacefully. Because why be holding yourself to a life that's temporary when you can experience something that's permanent with the endless supply of kids looking on? The attitude that Pete was having because, you know, he's never been opened up the box and thinking this type of life with them would be best. This does seem like a logical choice and the only one that makes sense for Stinky Pete the most happy, as he did push for such events while evidently behind the scenes. Where the question you are probably asking right now is, why haven't I talked about him a whole lot quite yet? Well, that was the intention of the movie, so perfectly played to make events set behind behind him until the twist comes, where Buzz comes back to remind him that he taught Woody himself in the first place of being a child's plaything, that being there for a child to grow up is more important than being locked in the case to be shown off for eternity. The worth of a toy just comes from the heart of a kid who loves them dearly as if they were living themselves, and that is what the purpose of life fulfills the most. And the video popping up again is to remind Woody of his own purpose that triumphs any fear he had when millions of kids would love the chance to have a friend like him. The message that the song "You Got a Friend in Me" that Toy Story is known for, played time and time again, is where we stick together and become the better for it. The stuff that reminds him that he needs to be there for Andy and has the chance to change things for Jessie and Bullseye to live and love again. That even this era might not last forever, the importance is just being there and loving the child as is. But how Pete actually opens up his stinky attitude outside the box, revealing he was behind the TV remote incident, locking Woody back in the room from stopping to leaving. His explanation for all of this is just his bitter own heart, who was never played with, rotting on a dime shelf, never to be bought until Al came into his life. It's a great change because you were able to understand the journey characters like Woody and Jessie took to this certain point, and how they were ones that were open to change, but how it's now shut out by the man who was in the middle the entire time. Instead of people who could or have experienced such loss, we finally get the picture of those who were never able to see either, hence why the argument of ignorance enters that very picture. Like, instead of getting in on Woody's plan to get Jessie and Bullseye to spend time with Andy as his newest toys, which would be his first ever experience with a child ever, he immediately rejects that and forces others to accept their place in his own view behind a plate of glass, which in fact is only a minor upgrade from the box he was stored in his entire life for the most part. We remind ourselves that in this beginning era of Pixar compared to Disney is how their villains weren't really evil but carried more emotional pain and anger at the world being looked on by a dime shelf. So again, when you accustom yourself to that very lifestyle and what Pete has been through being in that box until this very point, you find a need to conform to this and anyone else in your contact to that view. That this species upgrade is important to his own development because his own loneliness caused him to be this way. So even if he's given a chance at the same time with loving with what Woody realized with what he has now and giving him to Andy, he still comes up with a variety of excuses that are legitimate in themselves in the current passage of time. Looking at the same reality of Emily and the foreshadowing of what Toy Story 3 would carry on influence when Andy did grow up and have to go to college. The cycle that repeats itself so that no toy would ever be able to stop. You are motivated by what you see and what you hear that conforms to this comforting view that has sheltered you to this lifestyle rather than a new opportunity that sounds scary and contradicts those very statements we just laid out. Unfortunately, pulling him back into the game by force with our own secondary antagonist Al taking them to the airport to get his only deal of a lifetime. This is where we cut straight to his next scene being his last near his defeat because of how high the stakes were and what Woody could have been being shipped off straight to Japan. So what we know here that happens is how Pete wants to keep his worldview in check, punishing and punching Buzz while ripping Woody's arm back to square one where the movie started off, becoming a hypocrite to his own ideals of harming other toys. Like to him, it's either to submit to his own views or be torn apart in a million pieces where nobody will be allowed to play with him until he finally gets flashed. Sometimes I like to think he does this thing to convince himself he'd never be able to experience true happiness for his own good. He doesn't believe life can change for the better, so he decides to make the fears of other toys come true in that path. His character is meant to be more of a realist of events that happen as he predicted the entire plot of Toy Story 3 as seen right here.
Children destroy toys! You'll all be ruined! Forgotten! Spending eternity rotting in some landfill!
And although he says something like this that we've seen come true a bit in Toy Story 3, we still know it's not the full truth as the purpose of a toy depends on their will to carry on, to realize there is something worth living for in the moment rather than rotting for eternity like he says in the landfill. Instead, where he ignored the fact he was going to be rotting behind a glass case like he's just done through this plastic box his entire life. And that's where the movie's genius truly shines when they defeat him. The lesson of playtime that Woody so smugly says when they put him next to a backpack of a girl who gladly accepts him. Because how do you open an ignorant person? Well, in this case, you force them inside a girly backpack next to Barbie who got slapped and painted with stickers. I mean, it's not like that for the entire case, or logically in real life, but not a bad fate for our main villain if you apply what this truly means for them. Again, remembering he had no interaction with the kid his entire life up until this point, and now he finally gets that chance. Where although it might be scary for him finally giving us what most of us seem as the deserved punishment he needed as a villain, it's not bad for where he was. Because it was actually mentioned online somewhat that he liked that his face was painted on. He appreciated his new owner and his new life more. This is where you could see that this ignorance can go both ways and can be redeemed in some way, even if it could be off-screen or implied by what was forced, where people need to learn sometimes that ignorance is not always bliss by what you experience. People need to open their hearts and minds to each other rather than reject ideas completely. Don't just say one thing because a box traps you from doing so. Do something because you're open to see it. Because you know, he wasn't a complete bad toy, say akin to what we see later Lotso did abusing his own power, but just an embittered lonely old man who never actually was able to experience what other toys have been in these very films for the most part. Remembering what we would see later on with other villains or anti-villains as I like to call, with Gabby Gabby in a similar vein of not experiencing that, but more on the hopeful side of things. Not angry as a major difference to those characters, but being more hopeful as it was fit to her personality, and more of the idea of people who just needed to have that experience in their life. That they're good people, but they just never got the actual validation they needed. That you see something and you believe it as is, when it's not the whole truth of what creates a better person. What creates unique and great villains for the parts they have to play in our own destinies. It is for us to learn and to grow to be better humans in the comparing methods of acceptance versus ignorance, and the fact it wasn't a bad defeat in the end, and was all for good and really welcomed. So I'm all done. Goodbye.